We're on, but am I on? I'm on. Can you hear me? I probably should talk if I'm looking to you to see if the mic's working. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the class on I Am Resolved. We talked last week. We did an introduction for this class for some of you that may not have been here. And I also said this was going to be a little bit of a challenging class, and we were going to challenge each other. And I don't know, maybe there's a few less faces, people who didn't want to be challenged in here this morning. I hope that's not the case. But we're going to pick up where we left off last week, and we're going to talk about being resolved. Last week we mentioned that being resolved meant that we were firmly determined to do or to change something. And we all know that there are things in our lives, and they're all individual things that might be different for each and every one of us, but there are all things in our lives that we need to change, things that God commands us to change, things that our human nature really tries to convince us otherwise we don't need to change. But we've got to break that pattern. We've got to commit ourselves and be firmly determined to put our foot down and say enough is enough and to change. And that's where being resolved comes into place. We all acknowledge that as disciples of Christ, we've decided to be a follower of Christ. There are some things, very specific things we need to change. And last week, I kind of teased you a little bit on things that we were going to talk about through the course of this quarter, through the course of this class. Some things that we need to, as Christians, challenge each other to do. Things that we need to be and things that we need to be about. And things that would not just happen as part of our day-to-day exercise unless we made a conscientious decision and effort to be resolved to change them. These changes don't happen on their own. They're a moment-by-moment and day-by-day choice that we make to be resolved to follow what God is asking us to do and what God is expecting us and who God is expecting us to be. So that was last week, and as I thought about what we were going to talk about this week, I teased you with a couple of different topics that we were going to reach as we go through this course. When I thought about the topic we're going to talk about today, initially when I was making the list of topics we were going to cover, I thought, well, this is a nice, light, easy one that we'll stick somewhere in the middle as a little bit of a reprieve. But the more that I really thought about it, and the more I guess that in a way God spoke to me this week, the more I realized that personally this was something that I needed to look at. It's a challenge. This idea came up last week actually in Matt's comments, and the more I think about it, the more that we're going to talk today, what we're going to talk today about is something that sadly, I'm afraid to say, is perhaps one of the more difficult things we have to resolve ourselves to do. And when I tell you what the topic is, you're going to think, well, no, that's ridiculous. This is an easy one. But the more that we think about it, I think you're going to find that, no, it really can be quite a challenge. This morning, we're going to spend our time here talking about being resolved to be joyful. Being resolved to find joy in our lives. Seems like that should be an easy thing, doesn't it? The reality is that it's not such an easy thing. I know it's not for me. I can't speak for everyone in here, but I think we could probably all agree it's difficult to find joy sometimes. And I think that that's natural. In fact, I think it's scriptural that there are going to be times that joyfulness is hard to find. And we've got to resolve ourselves to be a people during those times to seek it out. On the surface, it seems like it ought to be easy. After all, we've all experienced joy. We all know what it is to experience joy, to have the goodness of God in our lives. We love joy, don't we? Yeah, you can be joyful in your response. Yeah, we love joy. Before we dive in, let's take a moment for some group participation here. So I'm just going to put it out there. What is it that you think of when I say joy? Our relationship with God? Yeah. That ought to give us joy. Absolutely. Portia? Family. Portia says family. What's that? Our relationship with others. I'll tell you, in the course of thinking about this all week and spending time on it, I've been trying to challenge myself to be resolved, to be more mindful and prayerful and looking at joy. And this morning when I woke up, I found myself praying that God would show me the joy of my life. And no sooner had I said that than I hear the door open up and Wyatt come running in to jump on the bed. And I thought, amen. We find joy in our families. We find joy in our relationships. Where else do we find joy? Okay, uplifted from the Spirit. Absolutely. Joy is a fruit of the Spirit, right? Part of being one and one with the Spirit is experiencing joy. In the spirit of that, where does joy come from? The heart. Okay. Certainly manifests there sometimes. Where else? From contentment, Phil says. Your mind. Okay, from our minds. Does it come from anything that we do to fulfill our own needs? Or does true joy come from somewhere beyond that? Yes, Ed. He's got the mic coming for you.
A few years ago, there was a survey in the parade about what made people happy. Mm-hmm. And the number one thing was helping others.
Okay, by helping others. I think we'll see some overlap with that, with what we're talking about. Jeannie?
For me, it comes from setting my heart on things above.
Okay, absolutely. I think we're definitely going to get to that point. Jeannie said from setting our hearts on things above. I think that we're going to find today, not to bury the lead here, I think we're going to find today that the closer our walk is when we resolve to be hand in hand with God and follow His example, we're going to see that joy is a byproduct of that. Yeah.
You know, sometimes when my granddaughter is at our house, and I see how easily she can be joyful and happy because she doesn't have all the clutter in her mind,
okay,
you know, that makes her stay unhappy, you know, so she's very easily entertained, you know, but for us, we try to have so much clutter on a day-to-day basis in our mind that it's kind of make it harder trying to surrender to God, you know, and try to be uplifted.
Absolutely.
Even though you read the words, you know, sometimes it's hard to still.
It's easy when you spend time with children to understand why Jesus wants us to be more like children. As we grow in wisdom and we grow in stature, we also grow in our understanding of how evil this world is and how easy it is to fall into the comforts of this world. Yeah.
And so I've learned to separate joy and happiness.
Okay, yeah.
Is a big thing. And because I'm not always going to be happy, but I can always be joyful.
All right, we're going to get there, so I don't want to cut you off, but yes, I do agree with you. There is a difference between joy and happiness. And joy is something that we experience sometimes in the void of happiness. We can still find joy, and we'll talk about that in a little bit here as well. One last quick question, and this maybe just is something for you to ponder. Is joy something that we can lose? I mean, they lost it in Mudville just because Casey struck out, right? I mean, joy is something that we can lose. Can we truly lose it? I don't know, but we can lose sight of it very easily, scarily easily. It is far too easy for us to lose sight of the joy that we have, or the joy that we have access to through the God that we serve. You know, ever since we were little kids, we've all known that we have the joy. Joy, joy, joy. We know where we keep it. Where? Down in our hearts. We know that it ought to make us happy, and we know that it's there to stay, right? How easy is it to forget that, though? How often do we stop and take the time to remind ourselves of that? Because the farther we get away from experiencing joy, the easier it is to lose sight of it. And the more difficult it can be to convince ourselves to walk the path back towards it. While we know that we have access to this joy, we also know that not every day in our life is going to be filled with blue skies and rainbows and sunbeams from heaven. Life is hard. Life is difficult. Joy can be an elusive thing for us in this life and in this world, and especially, it seems, when we need it the most. And we all know that to be true, because we all experience difficulties and pain in this world. No one in here is a stranger to pain. None of us are a stranger to illness. We've all experienced the death of people that we love and care for. We've all grieved. We've all helped each other through those moments. We've all suffered from loneliness, from depression, from despair. These are problems that, as we see in the world, are only growing, it seems. These are problems that, when you're going through them, seem like you can never escape them. We all know those feelings all too well. And sometimes you feel like the world is on fire only to turn on the TV and find out that that's the reality for a lot of people in California right now. This is a hard world to live in. This is a hard place to be a human being. And we would probably argue this is a hard place to follow and keep our eyes on all the glories that God has for us. So how do we do it? How do we remind ourselves? Well, if you were listening last week, the overlying theme for this is we're going to be resolved to make a point to look for it. Because God calls us to look for it. How do we find joy in such hardship? I'm going to tell you right now, up front, it's going to require us to be resolved in our search for it. Because you don't just stumble upon joy when you're so far away from it. You have to seek it out. And this morning, we're going to take our look, we're going to take some examples from the Bible of some people who experience joy, and some people who talk a lot about joy. Some of you probably have some guess of who do you think in the Bible talks the most about joy? Who are some people that we hear talk a lot about joy? Paul? Paul does speak to us about joy, certainly about rejoicing. Thinking somebody who dealt with a lot of pain and despair, had a lot of highs and lows, and wrote a lot about it in the Old Testament. David. David is who I'm thinking of, mostly because we have a lot of his writings and a lot of the worst times in his life, and yet he still finds time to think and to try to set his mind on God, putting God first, restoring himself, and restoring that joy in his life. Few people in the Bible speak as frequently and as passionately about joy as King David does. And while I think it makes sense to us as students of the Bible, let's stop for a second to think about the life of King David. This is a life of tremendous ups and downs, and then ups and downs again, and ups and downs again. He lived rags to riches, to rags to riches. He spent feels like more than half of his life fleeing from people trying to kill him. It was a life of tremendous highs and colossal lows. You think about it. He was king over Israel at the height of its power. But he spent what seems like half of his life fleeing from people who openly and aggressively were trying to actively kill him. And most of those people were his former friends, mentors, and family. Things get bad for us, but it hasn't got that bad for me yet. I can't speak for everyone here. That's difficult. There's a lot there that would cause us to lose our joy. David ascended to the throne and established a powerful kingdom, but he spent a great deal of time hiding in caves, acting like a crazy person, losing all of his self-dignity, all of his friends, just to escape danger, just to escape death, just to continue to keep living. He did these things. Yes?
Well, how David and the psalmist was talking about, if I go to the highest heavens, you are there. If I go to the deepest depths, you are there. You can put yourself in that same situation. If life throws different curves at you, and also in John 16:33, Jesus told him about that. You know, the joy, the inner peace, it comes through Christ, but it comes with a price.
It's true.
So it comes with a price. So that's what the joy. And also go to Revelation 21:4. God said, I'll wipe all tears from your eyes. So coming a disciple of Christ, or getting that inner joy, getting that inner peace, it comes with a great price, but it comes upon you. Are you willing to do that?
Absolutely, absolutely. You talked about Psalms 139 where David shows really what we're going to kind of look like here in a minute. He says, when I'm at the highest of highs, you're there. When I'm at the lowest of lows, you're there. And while we all understand that intellectually, we can't escape God. When we're at the highest of highs, it's easy to forget how we got there. And when we're at the lowest of lows, it's easy to forget that God is still there and God is still trying desperately to get us back to a good place. Thinking further about David, as a warrior, he experienced the terrors of hand-to-hand combat. Those things were second nature to him. You think about that. We know that he took lives. He took his tens of thousands. But we have to imagine that he also saw a lot of his friends die terrible deaths, and then carried the burden and the understanding that most of those people did that in service to him. That's a terrible weight to think about, to have to bear. There are a lot of reasons that a lot of excuses we could give to David to getting down on himself, to allowing himself to forget about joy in his life. David was blessed in so many ways and recognized by God himself as someone with a tremendous heart, but he struggled his whole life with his own selfish desires. And those resulted in a great amount of pain, punishment, and even the death of a child. It's a tremendous weight to bear. These are all things that when you think about, man, it'd be easy to lose sight of joy in that. It would be easy to just envelop yourself in the negativity and to forget about the goodness of God. Yes? No, you're okay.
It just opens up a lot of things, but I just think about myself as well as you put yourself in those characteristics. Like Scripture says, things are written aforetime, are written for our learning. Mm-hmm. He learned a lot from those experiences throughout his life, like you say, the highs and lows and the mistakes he have made in his life. But the Bible tells us, he was a man after God's own heart. And so we are followers of Christ, and so we're going to go through some highs and lows in life, but don't lose that focus. The joy comes in, and we don't let Satan just tell us, well, sin, go ahead and just live a rapid life. No, God has called us in the dark. He's called us into the marvelous light. And so that's our focus. And so when you talk about David, you got to get the little threads out there, what he went through, but he always reverted back to God. That's where his joy came from. Is going back to God, and God will lift him back up.
That's true. And David has a great lesson for us. I'm on page 2 and you're hitting page 6, but we're going to get there. No, you're all right. You're all right. Hey, because look, if this is a class about deliberately finding out joy, it's all right to jump ahead. We want to be mindful. We want to look and think and be resolved to be a people who, in the situations of our lives, stop and focus on what's important, and remember that as followers of Christ, there's a lot that comes with that. There's a lot of difficult things that come with that, but one of the things that we are promised is joy. And we're going to talk about that. Jeannie, you had something you want to say?
A couple of months ago, Tim did a sermon on the road of suffering is also the road of joy. And I have experienced that, and I'm living it now, that in this time of suffering for me, not having Bert, I have so much joy. I mean, yesterday felt like I couldn't put one foot in front of the other, and Wyatt came over, changed everything. The whole rest of the day
So Wyatt just needs to go to everybody's house, I think is what we learned this morning.
But God sends us what we need if we're looking and if we ask.
Absolutely. God does send it to us. And that's where we're headed here. When we look at the life of David, it'd be very easy. I guess the point I'm trying to make at this point in the lesson is it'd be very easy to see someone who could lose sight of joy. As a matter of fact, if the Psalms read more like a book of self-pity poetry, I think we'd probably understand that. David was a prolific enough writer. I think we'd probably still read and study it, but it would sure miss out on a lot of the lessons that David learned and that he is trying to teach us so that we don't have to go through those difficult things that he went through. Let's take a look at some of the things David says about joy in the Psalms. If you look in Psalms 4, David compares his joy to that of the farmers at harvest time. He says that his joy is greater than theirs because the verse suggests that joy and peace come from trusting in the Lord's provision over what the earth or what this world has to offer and provide us. Even in the small things, David learned, okay, I have a meal, my needs are met. How much more so does God meet my needs? And it brought him joy. There's a lesson for us in that because most of us in here have our needs met. Does that mean that, that we're always living in joy? In fact, sometimes when our needs are being met, it's the time when we most are easily quick to forget where that comes from, where that blessing comes from, and how blessed we really truly are to have it. There's a lot of joy in that. David understood it. In Psalms 51, David asks God to restore unto him the joy of God's salvation and grant him a willing spirit to sustain him. We all know this psalm. We sing it, right? Restore unto me the joy of your salvation, renew a right spirit in me. In this psalm, David is lamenting that he cannot experience joy while he still harbors this unconfessed sin. And in particular, in Psalms 51, it's the sin of his adultery with Bathsheba. He can't experience joy while he is living in this sin without giving it back over to God and confessing it. And once he does that, once he confesses and is confronted with what he's done wrong and is penitent of it and repents from it and confesses back to God, what does God do for him? He restores the capacity for joy. Sometimes we find ourselves in situations of our own creation. Oftentimes we find ourselves in situations of our own creation where we can't find joy because we are hanging on to something we've got no business being involved with sin. God's saying, let go of it, embrace me, come back, and then you will again have the capacity for joy. Yes?
When he had the thorn in the flesh, he asked God 3 times to remove it, and God said, my grace is sufficient for you. And then he said, I'd rather glory in my infirmities. So he found joy, even though he was going through something. Sometimes God says no. Sometimes God says wait. So God is not going to, it's not like I say, he's not like a genie. When you ask something, he's just going to take it away. But God wants you to see the greater lesson in that. When you see the greater lesson in that, then you get the joy from that. That's right. That God's showing you love, or sometimes we call it tough love. And so he's seen it, and now he can be able to work harder and be able to be a better example. Even though he was apostle, guided by the Holy Spirit, we have the indwelling gift of the Holy Spirit, which is our guide and our teacher, but we have to yield to those things.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think there's a lot of truth to that, and I think, as a matter of fact, when we truly resolve ourselves to change, if it's difficult for us to keep that resolve, but it's something that we're truly committed to, God sometimes can give us a thorn in the flesh to remind us, you're resolved to put this part behind you. And that's hard for us to understand sometimes, but it's worth it to listen when God gives us something to remind us. Yes?
I love creating me a clean heart. Restore to me the joy of my salvation. I don't know, that has spoken to me for 40 plus years, 50 years of the moment I came out of that water, the moment my salvation was sealed, that feeling is exuberance, and that's the best feeling that you have for a definition of joy. And, David danced before the Lord. That just overwhelming, exuberant, amazing, unyielding joy. And people are like, oh yeah, I'm happy. No. We're looking for the joy of my salvation. Yeah. And that moment that I'm certain that every person in this room has a definition in their head of what that joy was for them.
In particular, before we move on to the next passage, it is worth pointing out, in the challenging nature of this class, David could not experience that joy while he still harbored that sin. And sometimes when we find ourselves unable to find joy, we need to really challenge ourselves and challenge each other to examine ourselves to see if there's not something that we're holding on to, not something that we need to confess, that we need to make right with God in order to restore that to us. As we look at Psalms 13, David writes in a particularly dark time in David's life that he's expressing joy and trust in God's unfailing love. And he writes this, he says, "My heart rejoices in your salvation, and I will sing to the Lord, for he has been good to me." Even when David is hiding in a cave, fearing for his life, he's reflecting on how good God has been to him. Does that happen naturally? When you are at your lowest, do you just naturally think about all the good things that have come in your life? If the answer is yes, it's probably because you're thinking about all the things you had and have lost. But David is mindful, he is resolved in those moments to focus on the good that God has blessed him with, knowing that it can be restored to him and will be restored to him because we serve a God that is good. And if it's not in this life, how much more so is it going to be when we leave this life? That's what we've got to keep in mind. In Psalms 122, David writes this song of ascent, and he expresses his joy and anticipation in going to the house of the Lord and reflecting his love and worship. Just going up to the it was before the temple existed, but going up to the presence of God, where the Ark of the Covenant was, where the tabernacle was, just walking, just making that walk to know that he was going to be in God's presence and spend time with God, gave him joy, gave him a tremendous amount of joy. In 2 Samuel 22, David sings a song of joy after the Lord delivers him from his enemies, and in it he says, "The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer." He is filled with joy because he knows that he's been delivered. In 1 Chronicles chapter 29, we read a passage that highlights the joy that comes from giving willingly and wholeheartedly to the construction of the temple. David now is at a point in his life where he's been told he can't build the temple, his hands have too much blood on it, but he starts to put into to order and to effect all of the things so that his son can build the temple for the Lord. And they make up and take up a great collection. And in 1 Chronicles, the collection was so bountiful, was so great that the people, it says in verse 9, the people were filled with joy at the willing response of the people, for they had given freely and wholeheartedly to the Lord, and David the king also rejoiced greatly. There is joy in giving back. And oftentimes when we talk about giving back, the quickest association we make is that, we give what we can give monetarily, and that's great, and that's used and utilized, and that's a great thing, and I'm not taking away from that one bit. But God expects us to give back in other ways too. And he expects us to find joy in that service of openly and free of our own heart and of any hesitance, giving back to him, devoting ourselves and our time and our efforts to doing what Christ calls us to do. A lot of the things that we're going to talk about being resolved are the kind of things that we can give back. And so week by week, we're going to come and touch back on that topic. But it's important to see here that David makes a very specific point to talk about the joy that is derived from giving back to God specifically. Yes? Sorry, I'm making Matt run all over the place here.
Yes, when you're talking about that, it made me think about the Hebrew letter, chapter 10, verse 23 to 26, and how we ourselves as Christians, fellow believers, can stimulate one another as we get ready to come into the presence of the household of God and praise and sings and psalms and giving. That should bring us great joy. I mean, when you're singing, we're not singing to one another. We're singing praises to God. So it's we're collectively, but it's an individual thing as well, because God has given you joy. He has brought you from another week of trials and tribulations, and now there's joy when you come back and give this relief and this expression and this happiness to God. We should be thankful for that, and that's why I say stimulate one another as you see the day approaching, because life is short and life is fragile.
I'm glad you said that. And in the theme of saying this is going to be a challenging class if we take this seriously, brothers and sisters, if you leave here on a Sunday morning or a Wednesday night or any time that we've been together and you don't experience some modicum of joy, you really need to think about how you spent the last hour or 2 hours. You really need to think about what you're doing here. Because I said it last week, I'll say it again, I'll probably say it next week. Being a Christian is not a spectator sport. We are not brought here on Sunday morning to hold down a pew. We are here to be put to work. We've died to ourselves so that God can put us to work. And if we don't resolve ourselves day to day to act on that, that's exactly what we'll do. We will become complacent, and we will lose sight of our joy, and we will not be fulfilling the purpose that we set out to intend, that God intends for us. These are just a handful of times that when we see David making a point of reflecting on joy in his life. And I think there are some interesting takeaways for us here. And we've kind of discussed here already what we've kind of learned from David's expression of joy. But it's important to note, he does it in the high times, and he especially does it during the low times. In fact, perhaps more passionately he talks about it when he's at the lowest of lows. He gives thanks to God for the joy that he has, and he recognizes that there is something that God requires of him to give, and that participation, that ability to contribute to God's plan should bring us joy. And if it's not, perhaps we're not doing it right, or perhaps we're holding on to a sin that is keeping us, or sins that are keeping us from being able to truly experience what God is providing for us, what God's promised us. When we look at the life of David, it's worth noticing he makes a point of focusing on joy, not only in good times, but especially in the bad times. Perhaps more importantly is this: in every example that he gives us, what do we see him doing? We've talked about this a little bit. He is actively reflecting on how good God has been to him. Even when it would appear from anyone from the outside that maybe God's not being so good to him right now. You're hiding in a cave. People are trying to kill you. Your children are in open revolt against you. These are times when it doesn't seem like you think, whoa, God's really blessing me. But during those times especially, he is resolved to focus on God and striving to do God's will. He knows that when there's separation from God, God's not the one who stepped away. We're the ones who step away. And it's up to us to close the gap. God wants us to. He's calling us to. So how does David find joy in the depth of a cave when he's a wanted man with a price on his head? He does it by resolving himself to put that out of his mind and devoting himself to communing with God, to taking it to God, to recognizing it's on me to resolve to come back to you. How often do we have that talk with ourselves in the mirror? If it's not a minute-by-minute conversation, then we're probably not doing it frequently enough. It's difficult. It's challenging. But it's worth it. It's what we're called to do. David understands the joy of following God in every aspect of his life, and because he remembered the agony of trying to do it his way, he saw firsthand how painful that can be. So he literally writes songs to remind himself and us that we don't have to go through that. And if we find ourselves going through that, here's the express lane on getting back to the right place. Here's your express lane to finding joy again. Get back to God. Give back to God. Put away all of these things that you wedge between you and your Creator and embrace what God promises us, what God gives us to have joy. David shows us that when we lose sight of joy, it isn't because joy is not available to us. It's because we allow the shadow of this world to block our path to joy, the joy that's promised. And it's promised to us. All we have to do is resolve ourselves to follow God. It really is that simple. Now, doing it might not be as simple, but that's why we have to determine ourselves to make a change. In the New Testament, we see Christ confirm this for his apostles and as well for us today. In the book of John, we see a close account of Jesus' interactions with his followers heading into the final days of his ministry. His time here on earth is short. The crucifixion is just ahead. He's gotten to the point where he is speaking plainly about this, and his apostles still kind of seem clueless. And you have to imagine just the frustration that Jesus is under, just the tense, the agony, the chaos of all of it. In chapter 13 of John, Jesus predicts that he'll be betrayed by one of his followers. He's talking about Judas at this point. A couple verses later, he tells Peter point blank, "You will deny me." And Peter doesn't want to hear that. In chapter 14, he tells them, "I am going to leave you. And in fact, I'm going to die." And they, for all intents and purposes, look at him with a blank stare and be like, didn't understand what was happening. So just imagine for a moment the tension and the turmoil that must have been building up in those final days. Think of how little the apostles truly understood what Jesus was plainly saying to them. Think of how frustrated and isolated Jesus must have felt in those final days, knowing what he knew and the implications of what was to come. It's hard for us to even knowing all of it, it's still hard for us to even fathom what that experience must have been like. But it's important for us this morning to realize that during that time, in the midst of all of this going on, Jesus sits down with his disciples and he tells them a parable about a vine and a branch, and about the importance of being in God and God being in us, and about his relationship with the Father. And at the end, he takes time to very deliberately tell them to remember to seek out the joy of the Lord. These are 12 men, countless others who are probably within earshot of this, who did not at the time understand how much they were going to need the joy of the Lord very soon. And he takes a point in the end of this parable to say, you need to remember the joy of the Lord. In fact, we see in John 15, 10 and 11, verse 10 starts, "If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love." And then verse 11, "I have told you this, so that my joy may be in you, and that your joy will be complete." If you want to experience complete joy, Jesus is telling us, you've got to be in the Father, and the Father has to be in you. There has to be such tremendous love and willingness to give yourself over to God. And while the apostles might not have fully gotten that and grasped that in the moment, in the aftermath of Jesus' death, in the resurrection, in the return of Christ, you have to imagine that they truly experienced what it was to have complete joy. And you have to imagine that they thought back. John certainly did on this moment where Jesus tells them about this. And that instance alone is not the only time in the late chapters of John that Jesus makes a point to talk about joy. In the next chapter, again, he tells them he's going to die, and for a time, they're going to be left alone. And he says this to them a couple of times. He says, "I'm going to be left alone, but I'll come back, and then you will truly understand what God has done for you, and your grief will turn into joy." And I believe it's Philip, one of the apostles, says, "You're being kind of vague here. Can you be more specific?" And he says, "The time's coming, and the time is now where I'll be more specific, but I'm going to leave you, and I'm going to come back. You're going to experience grief, but your grief is going to turn to joy." Yes, Matt?
I think you're touching on a really interesting dichotomy where you have grief or hard times contrasted with joy. And in Hebrews, you might have been getting to this, it says, "For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." I think joy somehow was really driving Jesus to accomplish this awful thing of being well, for one, humbling himself to the point of a servant, dying, and facing all of this opposition here. But there was something that he was drawing on, which was that joy that was set before him. And, Becky, I have one more verse that says, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus. His joy is there also for us, to drive us through our hard times, looking forward to that promise of sitting down with Jesus, who's sitting down at the right hand of God. I mean, it's an invitation to join with that joy driving us. You've kind of been dancing around a little bit, but I'm thinking of joy as being one of the fruit of the Spirit, and we're to keep in step with the Spirit so that we can produce that fruit.
I think for sure when you talk about in Hebrews the joy of Christ going to the resurrection, the fact of the matter is he was also setting an example for us. He was quite literally going to die to himself to be reunited to the Father. It's exactly what we're asked to do, to die to ourselves and devote ourselves to be born renewed, devoted to Christ. That's the fulfillment of our joy. If that doesn't make us joyful, then we're losing sight of what God's promises are for us. Thank you, Matt. I appreciate that. In John 16, 20-22, when he talks about their grief turning to joy, in verse 20 it begins, this is Jesus speaking to the disciples, "Very truly I tell you, you will weep and mourn while the world rejoices. You will grieve, but your grief will turn to joy." And he likens it to a woman giving birth that has pain and anguish, but at the moment when the child is there, there's such overwhelming joy. Picks back up in verse 22, he says, "So now it is with you. Now is your time of grief, but I will see you again, and you will rejoice, and no one will take your joy away." Can we lose our joy? Only if we lose sight of it, because no one can take it from us. It is a gift that God gives to us. He ends that chapter in John by telling his disciples in verse 31, "Do you now believe?" Jesus replied. "A time is coming, and in fact has come, when you will be scattered, each to your own home. You will leave me all alone, yet I am not alone, for my Father is with me. I have told you these things, so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble." Think about that for a moment, because he's not just speaking to his apostles here. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome this world. You know, when we read the book of John, we talk a lot about the great I am statements. We've got to spend a little bit more time talking about the I have statement that Jesus gives us right here. I have overcome this world. Jesus has overcome the world. And if you have a hard time finding joy, or maybe more likely you've gotten too good at forgetting where to look for joy, then it's time that you and I decide to firmly determine to change something in our lives and resolve to stop and remind ourselves of the following things. One, God wants us to experience joy. He wants it. It's a gift he gave us through the Spirit. Two, he sacrificed a great deal, in fact, everything, to provide us with the opportunity for joy. And we owe it to ourselves to not just acknowledge that, but to be resolved to change the way we see every aspect of our life and embrace it. Embrace what God is calling us to do. The joy of the Lord isn't a feeling we experience at our highest of highs. It's not something that we lament the loss for in our lowest of lows. It's the comfort that comes with understanding that you're never so far away from God that he isn't calling you to come back home. And he's waiting to welcome you. Whatever it is that you lack, you serve a God who provides you and your soul with preparing a place for you for eternity so that you can be joyful in the presence of God. No matter what obstacle might be in front of you, you serve a God who has already overcome it. Does that mean we'll never experience sadness? No. There will be a time of grief. Christ tells us that. He tells us this world is going to rejoice while we are sad. But that doesn't mean that we're relegated to live a life without joy. It means we need to seek it out. It does mean that ultimately we serve a God with the power to turn our grief into joy. And when we resolve ourselves to be in him and to allow him to be in us, we can experience that joy. If you're here this morning, and I said last week, we're going to challenge ourselves in this class and through the course of this. If you're here this morning and you feel like you haven't experienced joy in a while, if you feel like you've forgotten what joy is, I know this is sounding like some kind of invitation. I'm not asking anybody to come forward. I promise you I will not lead a song. Don't let this opportunity leave this morning to leave this building and have it be another Sunday where you leave here without experiencing joy. We're not out of time. You are surrounded by your brothers and sisters. There is nowhere on earth that should be more supportive, more loving, and more caring for you and I, each one of us individually together. And there is no excuse why we should not take this opportunity to share with each other, to confess the sin that's keeping us from joy, to encourage each other in our highs and our lows. That being one with God will restore a joy that is eternal. Don't leave here this morning without taking advantage of that. Be resolved to change something today so that you can experience joy. We're all on this journey together. Don't leave here without taking one of your brothers and sisters along with you and experience the joy in sharing. The joy of doing life together. That's what this is all about. That's what this series and this year has been all about. Find where Jesus is and go to him. And take everyone with you. That's what we're called to do. Let's continue to hold each other accountable. Let's continue to grow together in the Lord. And let's be resolved to seek out the joy that comes with following God's plan in our life. We are running out of time, but I want to leave the rest of the time we've got this morning. Anybody has any questions, quotes, qualms, quips, quabbles? Anything to share? Jeannie.
One of the greatest joys I have and have had all my Christian life is sharing my faith with people. I don't know what it is, but it is the blood in my veins. I love it. It gives me great joy. I don't know what it is, but I think in the church we can fall short in that. I think we're just missing out. It is just plain old fun. But anyway, that's a great joys.
Well, when we're not uniting ourselves in our actions and our thoughts and our minds, Ed had something up here, Matt. We are missing out. You know, we're living beneath our privilege. We're not experiencing everything that God has promised. So, Ed, yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking some thoughts got along with what Matt was saying. I was thinking while David was in the cave hiding from Samuel, what could bring him joy? And I thought, well, he was the anointed one from God.
Yeah.
And that's why he didn't want to kill Samuel, because Samuel was anointed. So that was his whole joy from there, you know.
Yeah. It can always get worse, but you know what? It can always get better. And that's what God tells us. When it's worse, you can wallow in it and get farther away from God's plan for you, or you can be resolved to change something and to turn yourself back. We are out of time this morning. I thank you all for your thoughts. We'll be back, Lord willing, next week with another resolved point, and I hope you'll all be a little resolved to search out joy this week. Thank you.